When the empath wakes up, something subtle yet irreversible begins to move beneath the surface of the psyche. It does not announce itself with noise or drama. It does not come dressed in confrontation or explanation. It arrives quietly, like a shift in gravity. And yet the narcissist feels it before you speak, before you act, before you even consciously understand what has changed. This is because what awakens in you is not a behavior. It is not a boundary. It is not even courage in the ordinary sense. What awakens is the self beginning to withdraw its energy from an unconscious pact that was never spoken but always enforced. You must understand that long before any relationship becomes pathological on the surface, it is already sealed at the level of the unconscious. The empath and the narcissist do not meet by accident. They recognize each other through a shared wound, but they respond to that wound in opposite ways. The empath learned early that survival came through attunement, through reading the emotional weather, through becoming a mirror so precise that love might finally remain. The narcissist learned something equally early but far darker. That survival came through control of reflection, through shaping how others see them, through extracting psychic energy from those willing to disappear into usefulness. For a long time, this arrangement appears functional. The empath feels meaningful, needed, special. The narcissist feels validated, powerful, real. But beneath this apparent harmony lies a quiet violence. The empath is exiled so that the relationship may continue. The narcissist does not need to destroy you actively. They only need you to keep abandoning yourself on schedule. This is why awakening is so disruptive. When the empath wakes up, they do not suddenly become aggressive or cold. They become opaque. And opacity is intolerable to the narcissistic psyche. The narcissist lives through reflection. They must be felt, read, anticipated. When your inner posture shifts, when your attention begins to fold back toward your own center, the narcissist experiences this as a loss of oxygen. Something vital is no longer being supplied. You may think awakening is a thought, a realization, a sentence you finally say out loud. But that is not how the unconscious works. Awakening is a reorganization of libido, of psychic energy. It is the moment your soul stops leaning forward. And because this shift happens below language, it is perceived long before words appear. The narcissist feels it in your timing, in your silence, in the absence of urgency. They feel it when you no longer rush to repair emotional disturbances that you did not create. They feel it when your eyes no longer search their face for cues about who you are allowed to be. In analysis, I often observed that patients would believe they were hiding their inner change successfully while those around them reacted with sudden hostility, anxiety, or provocation. This puzzled them until they understood a fundamental truth. The unconscious speaks first. The psyche registers changes in orientation immediately. Words are always late. The narcissist feels your awakening as a threat because it disrupts the archaic fantasy that governs them, the fantasy of centrality in their inner world. Others exist to orbit, to affirm, to stabilize a fragile core that cannot regulate itself. When you begin to withdraw your psychic investment, the narcissist does not interpret this as growth. They interpret it as betrayal. Not because you have promised anything explicitly, but because at an unconscious level you have been fulfilling a role that kept their inner chaos at bay. Here we must speak of archetypes. The empath often carries the archetype of the wounded healer. They sense suffering and move toward it instinctively, believing that presence will redeem pain. This archetype is ancient and noble, but when unconscious, it becomes a trap. The wounded healer forgets that healing cannot occur where there is no reciprocity, no humility, no capacity for reflection. The narcissist, by contrast, is possessed by the archetype of the false king, a ruler without inner legitimacy, dependent on admiration rather than authority, terrified of exposure, ruling not through order but through enchantment and fear. When the wounded healer awakens, they stop offering their wound as currency. They no longer believe that endurance is love. They begin to feel the weight of their own exhaustion, not as failure, but as information. And this is when the narcissist begins to panic. The panic rarely appears as fear. More often it appears as sudden criticism, guilt, manipulation, or theatrical vulnerability. The narcissist senses the shift and attempts to restore the old balance. They may accuse you of changing, of becoming selfish, cold, arrogant, or cruel. Notice the language. It always points outward. They cannot say, "I feel my supply diminishing," because that would require self-awareness. Instead they say you are no longer who you used to be, as if your former self was a fixed object rather than a survival adaptation. But the empath's awakening is not a rejection of compassion. It is compassion finally including the self. And this inclusion is revolutionary. The unconscious contract dissolves not through confrontation but through non-participation. You stop explaining. You stop defending. You stop volunteering your inner world for inspection. And because the narcissist has always lived inside your reactions, your withdrawal feels to them like disappearance. This is why they feel it before you speak. Speech belongs to the ego. Awakening begins in the self. The self does not argue. It does not justify. It reorders. And once reordered, the old dynamics cannot be resurrected without force. In dreams, this phase often appears as distance, elevation, or movement away from a crowded place. Patients report dreams of climbing hills, standing on thresholds, or watching others from behind glass. These are not symbols of superiority, but of differentiation. The psyche is learning to see without merging. The empath is discovering that intimacy does not require self-erasure. To the narcissist, this differentiation feels like abandonment. But it is not abandonment. It is individuation. And individuation is the most threatening process imaginable to a psyche that depends on fusion and control. Understand this clearly. You do not awaken against the narcissist. You awaken toward yourself. The narcissist merely experiences the consequences of no longer being at the center of your psychic universe. And because they have no center of their own, this loss feels catastrophic. In the beginning, you may feel guilty. Guilt is the last defense of the old system. It arises when the superego, shaped by early relational expectations, protests the loss of familiar suffering. But guilt fades as alignment strengthens. The body relaxes. The breath deepens. The nervous system learns a new rhythm that is not calibrated to someone else's instability.